I now introduce Susan McKay, who's CEO of the National Women's Council of Ireland. She's also known to many of us through the last 20 and more years as one of Ireland's most interesting commentators and thinkers on the awkward, difficult issues, whether it's the North, whether it's women experiencing violence, sexual humiliation. Her work has made us all think, and her work has also, I think her post now is enormously difficult in times of budget cuts, but what she brings to it and the work that she's doing now, I think is an enormous opportunity for her thinking to be put into action. And perhaps for someone who comes from the North and the work that we are looking at around conflict, if any of you haven't read the book Bear in Mind Those Dead, I suggest you do, because in the sense of how to handle the humiliation of conflict and bring it into something which is a positive process, it's an extraordinary contribution. I'd like to ask Susan now to speak on the National Women's Strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inez. This is a very sombre day for Ireland, and not because of the IMF. I think on a day where we're hearing in the news about the deaths of the murders of 3 women and 3 young children, we don't need to be reminded of the devastation which is caused by violence against women and children. When I started working for the National Women's Council in May 2009, everyone was talking about the Equality for Women measure. In particular, they were talking about the Equality for Women money. Groups were counting on it. They'd been encouraged to apply for what counts as major project funding in the women's sector, and some of them had applied for up to €200,000. When do you think we'll hear? They kept asking. It turned out that they had been kept waiting for more than a year. The Equality for Women measure falls under the National Women's Strategy, and the Women's Council, along with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and other social partners, sits on the monitoring group for the National Women's Strategy. The group meets, as the Minister has said, twice a year at dates chosen by the government. The Women's Council, Congress and the other social partners usually have a voluntary pre-meeting among ourselves to discuss the issues that we hope to raise. At the first such meeting I attended, I was surprised by the apparent unwillingness of the government representatives to divulge information. Questions about the EWM got evasive answers. That's the Equality for Women measure. When we pressed for details, we were reluctantly told that several million euros had been lost to the NWS. It's the economy, we were told darkly. Without apology for the delay, the Equality for Women measures were later sent out. Most of those who applied got no funding. About 30 groups were told that they were to receive grants of €30,000. They were instructed that none of the money was to be spent on childcare, transport or tea. Now, anybody who's ever organised a meeting of women knows that all of those elements are essential, particularly the last one. With difficulty, we managed to establish that the government had in fact ransacked the budget of the National Women's Strategy, handing over a further €10 million worth of European Social Fund money to the training agency FOSS, with no requirement attached to it that any of it be used on training for women. We protested. The then Minister for Equality wrung his hands. What could he do? We have to feed the prisoners and clothe the asylum seekers, he said. Government cuts to child benefit, community women's groups, to funding for services on violence against women all followed. And I want to just comment at the moment that one of the most disturbing things to the Women's Council about this current recession is that we are hearing from our member groups who deal with violence against women that the frontline services are experiencing a 40% or more increase in demand for their services. They are also experiencing typically cuts of 10% to their funding. Women are continuing to lose their jobs. We're hearing more and more about pregnancy discrimination. Yet, in March this year, the then Minister for Equality went off to New York to speak at the Commission on the Status of Women event to mark the 15th anniversary of the Beijing Platform. In an extraordinarily offensive speech, he declared himself very happy with the significant advances made towards gender equality in Ireland. The National Women's Strategy was, of course, the government's response to the original Beijing Platform in 1995, which called for national action plans to be drawn up. 10 years later, the UN's Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, pressed the government to act. Civil society was consulted during the drafting of the strategy, and we expressed concern that there was an evidence-based the evidence-based approach to making policy was not being taken. There was, we said, a lack of specific time-framed targets linked to achieving gender equality outcomes. But never mind all that negativity, the plan was launched in 2007 and was declared by the then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern and by Michael McDowell to be a shining light for the world. The National Women's Council welcomed it. There were very many aspirational good ideas in it, but we pointed out that its budget was rather small, 0.01% of the GDP, and that it would be difficult to measure its effectiveness. No timeframes, no targets, actions not quantified, their expected outcome unclear, and sometimes not even relevant to the indicators given. We also warned that its budget was likely to come under pressure in a department, Justice, with high spending responsibilities. A year after the launch, the government cut its budget in half. There was a 20% cut in funds to COSC, the new National Strategy on Domestic and Sexual Violence, and other cuts followed. Relevant targets in relation to the National Women's Strategy would include, for example, achieving a balance of 40% of women in the Dáil. We currently have only 13% and falling, and the government has so far been disinclined to take affirmative action to change this. And we welcome signals from Minister Mary White that she is going to work further to progress that, and we've been working closely with her on the issue. Targets would also include an acceptable percentage of household income being spent on childcare. We have one of the highest such percentages in the OECD. We would need actions and targets focused on the multiple and compound discriminations faced by ethnic minority groups. The National Women's Strategy should have a role in ending the treatment of women in direct provision in this country, for example. As things are, policymakers have little relevant information with which to judge how effective actions are, and advocates like the National Women's Council are unable to assess the degree of progress made. The European Commission has urged governments to see gender equality policies as a long-term investment, not as a short-term cost. It has warned against seeing equality as a luxury which can wait, when it is in fact an essential component of recovery. But the running down of the National Women's Strategy continues. The last scheduled monitoring committee was postponed, no reason was given, and a new date has not been set. There is a review process going on at the moment, and both Congress and the Women's Council have submitted to this on very similar terms to those I've just been discussing. Just this morning, before coming in here, I met with Shirley Graham, who's running the new process towards the National Action Plan on UN Resolution 1325, and I was so impressed by the way in which she is running that workshop process towards that. She's having an African woman singing a song at the beginning of her workshop, she's having an Irish woman singing at the end, she's having all sorts of ceremony built into that to show respect, as Inez has spoken about, to the women who are participating in it. Minister White has talked about the very effective model which she says that the National Women's Strategy offers in terms of monitoring and evaluation. I'm sorry to disagree with the Minister. The National Women's Strategy does not offer an effective model for the monitoring and evaluation of the new NAP on UN Resolution 1325. As a matter of fact, it tells us how not to do it. But not to close on a negative note, I would just like to say that I do feel that the National Action Plan currently being developed under Inez McCormack's very expert independent chairmanship may provide a very good model for monitoring and evaluation from which the National Women's Strategy could, if it really wants to become a living and meaningful document, learn a great deal. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Why did my heart sink just at the end? In the last 20-odd years, I've heard those gentle, measured tones speaking truth to power. And the sign I've learned hard ways in the North, and in terms of working for the people of no account, is whether speaking truth to power can be regarded as healthy, democratic, and to be engaged with. Because if we can't engage with the Susans of the world, representing the women who are not even in this room. I know there are women, by the way, in this room for the first time hearing about human rights frameworks, because some of them are coming to the process this afternoon, and you're extremely welcome. But that engagement is crucial if, in fact, we are serious about creating an inclusive democratic process. And it's as real as, again, as we create outcomes on the ground. It is not about being rude to each other or about being nice to each other. It is about being honest with each other and not defensive, and then creating a bridge that can get an outcome. So thank you, Susan.